This story is titled, My Brother Convinced Me to Take Over His Student Loan Payments While He Got Back on His Feet. Just found out he's been working in our family business the whole time, making triple my salary. I never thought I'd be sitting here, staring at my bank statements and feeling this overwhelming mix of rage and betrayal. The past 2 years of my life have been a carefully orchestrated lie, and the worst part? It was all orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. How could I have been so blind? My brother, the struggling graduate trying to get back on his feet, has been making triple my salary working in our family business, while I've been working overtime at a warehouse just to cover his student loan payments. The thing about trust is, once it's broken, it turns into something else entirely, and right now, all I can think about is making things right. Let me start from the beginning. I'm Danny, 25M, just your average guy trying to make ends meet in Augusta, Maine. Before this whole mess started, I was actually doing pretty well for myself. I had a stable job at a local warehouse, making decent money as a shift supervisor, nothing extraordinary, but enough to afford a small apartment and put some savings aside each month. My brother Tommy, 28M, and I were always close, probably because we lost our mom when we were teenagers and had to rely on each other while our dad Mike, 52M, built up his small landscaping business. Growing up, Tommy was always the golden child, straight A's, captain of the debate team, you name it. He went off to an expensive private college, while I chose to start working right after high school. I never resented him for it. We all have different paths in life, right? Our dad was so proud when Tommy graduated with his business degree, even though he had to take out substantial student loans to make it happen. Everything changed 2 years ago when Tommy showed up at my apartment one evening, looking completely defeated. He told me he'd lost his job in Boston and couldn't keep up with his $1,200 monthly student loan payments. He was moving back to Augusta to start over and find entry-level work while living with our dad. The thought of my successful older brother having to move back home and start from scratch really got to me. Here's where my sister Amy, 26F, comes into the picture. She's always been the practical one, warning me that something felt off about Tommy's sudden return. But I brushed her concerns aside. After all, what kind of person would lie about something like this to their own family? So I made what I thought was a temporary sacrifice. I agreed to take over Tommy's loan payments while he got back on his feet. It meant picking up extra shifts, cutting back on everything except the bare necessities, and saying goodbye to my savings. But hey, that's what family is for, right? For 2 years, I watched my brother live modestly at Dad's place, occasionally mentioning unsuccessful job interviews and talking about how tough the job market was. He'd help around the house, do odd jobs for cash, and seem genuinely grateful for my help. Every time I'd start feeling the financial strain, he'd tell me how close he was to landing something stable, how he just needed a little more time. What I didn't know was that every morning, after I left for my warehouse shift, Tommy would drive to the other side of town to work at our dad's landscaping business. Not as some entry-level worker, mind you, but as the full-time operations manager, pulling in a salary that would make my jaw drop. And the way I found out? Well, that's when this story gets interesting. Have you ever sacrificed everything to help someone, only to discover they've been laughing behind your back the whole time? The truth came out in the most unexpected way possible. Last week, I decided to surprise my dad with lunch at his office, something I rarely did, because my warehouse shifts usually overlapped with his work hours. I'd taken a rare day off to handle some personal errands, and thought it would be nice to spend some quality time with him. As I pulled into the parking lot of Maine Green Landscapes, I noticed Tommy's beat-up Honda Civic parked right in the spot marked Operations Manager. At first, I thought he must be doing some temporary work for Dad, maybe helping with paperwork or covering for someone. My brother had mentioned picking up occasional odd jobs here and there, after all. But when I walked into the office, everything changed. There was my brother, sitting behind a massive desk in a private office, dressed in business casual, surrounded by project plans and employee schedules. The nameplate on his door read, Thomas Sullivan, Operations Manager. The secretary, Jenny, 31F, greeted him as Mr. Sullivan, and asked if he wanted to review the quarterly projections before the staff meeting. You know that feeling when your whole world shifts on its axis? When everything you thought you knew suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. I stood there frozen, as 2 years of unsuccessful job searches, and tough market conditions crumbled around me. Every extra shift I'd worked, every time I'd skipped going out with friends to save money, every sacrifice I'd made to help my struggling brother, it all flashed before my eyes. Tommy's face when he saw me. I'll never forget it. The color drained from his cheeks, and for once in his life, my smooth-talking brother was speechless. He just sat there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as Jenny awkwardly excused herself from the increasingly tense situation. But here's the real kicker. As I stood there trying to process everything, my dad walked in. He looked between us, confused at first, then understanding dawned on his face. "Danny," he said, "I thought you knew. Tommy's been running operations here for almost 2 years now. He's doing an amazing job. Profits are up 40% since he took over." 2 years. The exact amount of time I'd been paying his student loans. The exact period during which I'd watched him pretend to struggle, pretend to job hunt, pretend to barely get by. All while he was making triple my salary, working in a cushy office job that our father had given him. I didn't say a word. I just turned around and walked out, ignoring Tommy calling after me. As I drove home, my hand shaking on the steering wheel, I did some quick math. Over the past 2 years, I'd paid $28,800 in loan payments. That's $28,800 I'd scraped together from extra shifts and overtime, while my brother was making 6 figures and living rent-free at Dad's house. The worst part? I later found out that most of our family knew about Tommy's job. They'd all kept quiet, assuming I was aware of the arrangement and was just being a good brother by helping with the loans anyway. How many family dinners had I sat through, talking about my exhausting warehouse shifts, while everyone around the table knew the truth. But my dear brother Tommy had no idea what was coming next. Because while he might be the golden child with a business degree, I'd learned a thing or two about planning and patience during those long nights at the warehouse. And I was about to put those skills to very good use. Have you ever felt that moment when betrayal turns to cold, calculated determination? When you realize that sometimes the best revenge isn't served hot and fast, but cold and meticulously planned? That evening, my dad showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't answer the door, but part of me needed to hear what possible explanation he could have for this whole mess. As he settled into my worn-out couch, I noticed how he kept fidgeting with his wedding ring, something he only does when he's about to deliver bad news or make excuses. What came next made my blood boil. According to him, they'd meant to tell me about Tommy's position, but the timing was never right. Then came the real kicker. He started explaining how the business would have collapsed without Tommy's management skills. Apparently, my college-educated brother had revolutionized their operations, modernized their systems, and brought in major contracts. The implication was clear. My warehouse experience wouldn't have cut it. "Danny, you have to understand," he said, running his hands through his graying hair. "If we told you about Tommy's job right away, you might have stopped helping with the loans. We couldn't risk that. He needed to focus on saving the business, not worrying about debt." The casual way he dismissed my financial struggles made my stomach turn. In his mind, my sacrifice was just a necessary cost of keeping the family business afloat. But it got worse. He actually had the nerve to suggest that I should be proud of my contribution to the family's success. "Think about it, son," he said, leaning forward with that patronizing look I'd seen so many times before. "Your help meant Tommy could concentrate on growing the business. In a way, you're part of our success story." Success story? I'd been eating ramen noodles and working 60-hour weeks while Tommy was playing golf with clients and getting performance bonuses. My dad went on about how the business had doubled its revenue, how Tommy had hired 10 new employees, how they were finally stable enough to expand to neighboring counties. All while I'd been draining my savings account every month to pay for Tommy's education. The final straw was when he tried to guilt-trip me about family loyalty. "We're Sullivans," he said, as if our last name justified everything. "We take care of each other. Your brother needed this opportunity, and you helped make it possible. Isn't that what family's all about?" I sat there, letting his words wash over me, feeling a strange calm settle in. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about how they'd all sat back and watched me struggle, telling themselves it was for the greater good of the family business. How they decided my financial security was an acceptable sacrifice for Tommy's success. My sister Amy's words from 2 years ago echoed in my head. Something feels off about this whole situation. She tried to warn me, but I'd been too trusting, too willing to believe in family loyalty. Now I understood why she'd moved to Colorado last year, distancing herself from this toxic family dynamic. You know what's funny about betrayal? It's not just about the lie itself, it's about the moment you realize how many small decisions, how many quiet moments of complicity, led to that final revelation. And as I sat there listening to my father justify 2 years of deception, I made a decision of my own. What my father and brother didn't know was that during those long warehouse shifts, I'd made some valuable connections of my own. And I was about to put them to very good use. Because if they thought the family business was more important than family loyalty, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about both. Have you ever noticed how the people who talk the most about family loyalty are often the ones who take advantage of it the most? For the next month, I went about my life as if nothing had changed. I showed up to family dinners, nodded along to Tommy's fake job search stories, which he was still keeping up for some reason, and watched my father's nervous glances whenever money came up in conversation. But behind the scenes, I was preparing something that would make their betrayal look like child's play. During my years at the warehouse, I'd become good friends with Marcus, 45M, our company's regional manager. What my family didn't know was that before joining our warehouse, Marcus had spent 15 years running one of the largest landscaping companies in New England. He'd been trying to get back into the industry for years, and more importantly, he knew exactly how these businesses operated. I spent my evenings with Marcus, learning everything about the landscaping business. Balance sheets, client relationships, contract negotiations, I absorbed it all like a sponge. My warehouse job had actually taught me more about business operations than anyone in my family realized. While Tommy had been learning theory in college, I'd been living the practical reality of managing inventory, coordinating teams, and handling real-world logistics. The next step was setting up meetings with Maine Green Landscape's biggest clients. This was easier than you'd think. Many of them used our warehouse for their own storage needs, and I'd built solid relationships with them over the years. During casual conversations, I started dropping hints about the company's internal issues, making them just nervous enough to start asking questions about their contracts. Then came the master stroke. I knew Dad had been struggling with the company's finances before Tommy took over. What they didn't know was that I'd been documenting every penny I'd paid towards those student loans. $28,800, that's how much they owed me. But instead of demanding it back, I was going to make them an offer they couldn't refuse. I prepared a detailed presentation showing how I could streamline their operations even further. My warehouse experience gave me insights into cost-cutting measures that Tommy, with all his fancy degrees, had missed. I also had something else: documented proof of every payment I'd made, every extra shift I'd worked, and every sacrifice I'd endured while they built their success on my back. The timing had to be perfect. I waited until their biggest client, Hartford Properties, started expressing concerns about their contract renewal. Dad was already stressed about potentially losing their biggest account, and Tommy's flashy business school tactics weren't working on Hartford's practical-minded management. You know what's ironic about revenge? Sometimes the best way to get it is to become exactly what the other person pretends to be. Tommy played the role of the struggling job seeker while secretly running the business. Now it was my turn to play a role: the supportive brother who just wants to help the family business succeed. But this story isn't over yet. Because tomorrow morning, I'm walking into my father's office with a proposition that will change everything. And the best part? They're going to thank me for it. Have you ever noticed how the people who take advantage of your kindness never expect you to learn from their example? The morning of my meeting, I arrived at Maine Green Landscapes dressed in a crisp suit I'd borrowed from Marcus. Tommy's face when he saw me walk in was priceless, a mix of confusion and that same nervousness I'd seen ever since I discovered his lie. Dad was already in his office, looking worried as he reviewed the latest contract numbers from Hartford Properties. I laid out my presentation materials on the conference room table, watching them exchange uncertain glances. Then I dropped the first bomb. I pulled out documentation showing that Hartford Properties was planning to terminate their contract next month. Their eyes widened. This was information they didn't have yet. I'd learned about it through my warehouse connections, where Hartford's management had been openly discussing their dissatisfaction. Next came my proposal. I explained how my years in warehouse logistics had given me unique insights into operational efficiency. I walked them through a detailed plan to restructure their entire operation, showing them cost-saving measures they'd never considered. With each point, I could see my father's expression changing from skepticism to interest. Then came the real kicker. I pulled out the folder containing 2 years' worth of loan payment receipts, spreadsheets showing every extra shift I'd worked, and calculations of the total amount they owed me. The room went dead silent. Tommy started to speak, but Dad cut him off with a raised hand. My terms were simple. I would join the company as co-operations manager, working alongside Tommy. In exchange, they would repay every cent of the loan payments I'd made, plus interest, through a revised salary package. But here's where it got interesting. I also wanted a performance-based contract that would automatically promote me to sole operations manager if I could increase efficiency by 25% within 6 months. Dad tried to argue, but I had one more card to play. I revealed that I'd already spoken to Hartford Properties, and they were willing to not only stay with us, but expand their contract, but only if I personally oversaw their account. The choice was clear: accept my terms or lose their biggest client. Tommy sat there, his face growing paler by the minute. He knew what this meant. Within 6 months, I would be his direct superior, and every efficiency improvement I implemented would highlight his own shortcomings. His fancy degree meant nothing compared to my years of practical experience. Dad looked torn. He could see the business sense in my proposal, but he also knew what it would do to his precious golden child's position in the company. Finally, he spoke. "We need some time to discuss this." I stood up, straightening my tie. "You have until tomorrow morning. After that, I take my proposal and Hartford Properties elsewhere." As I walked out, I could hear them starting to argue behind me. Do you know what's beautiful about karma? Sometimes it lets you turn the tables so completely that your opponents end up thanking you for their own downfall. What happened next would reshape our entire family dynamic and teach them all a valuable lesson about underestimating the less successful brother. Because while Tommy had spent 4 years learning about business in a classroom, I'd spent 6 years learning it in the real world. And I was about to show them exactly what that meant. Have you ever had the satisfaction of watching someone realize that they completely underestimated you, right as their carefully built house of cards starts to collapse? The next morning, I arrived at the office exactly at 8 a.m. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dad and Tommy were already there, both looking like they hadn't slept all night. Before either of them could speak, Ginny rushed in to inform them that Hartford Properties had just called, asking specifically about the changes I proposed during my private meeting with them. I watched my father's face age 10 years in 10 seconds. He knew they were cornered. The company couldn't survive losing Hartford Properties, and now their biggest client was practically demanding my involvement. Tommy sat there, gripping his coffee mug so hard I thought it might shatter. Dad cleared his throat and started laying out their counteroffer. They would bring me on as co-operations manager, repay all the loan payments with interest through a structured payment plan, and agree to my performance-based promotion clause. However, they wanted a 9-month evaluation period instead of 6. I agreed, knowing it wouldn't make any difference in the end. As I signed the contract, I caught Tommy shooting me a look of pure venom. His perfect world was crumbling around him, and for once, his business degree couldn't save him. Over the next few weeks, I watched him scramble to justify his past decisions, desperately trying to defend his inefficient systems against my proven warehouse management techniques. The real surprise came during the 3rd week. I overheard a conversation between Dad and Tommy that I wasn't meant to hear. They were in Dad's office, arguing about the latest efficiency reports I'd submitted. My changes had already cut operational costs by 15%, and client satisfaction was at an all-time high. "I don't understand," Dad was saying, his voice heavy with disappointment. "How did we miss all of this? These are basic logistics improvements that should have been implemented years ago." The frustration in his voice was palpable. "Your fancy degree was supposed to prepare you for this kind of thing. Instead, your brother comes in with his warehouse experience and shows us how much money we've been wasting." Tommy tried to defend himself, but Dad wasn't having it. "Do you know what this makes me realize? While you were playing golf with clients and living off your brother's money, he was actually learning how to run a real business. We backed the wrong horse, Tommy, and now we're paying for it." The next day, Dad called me into his office. He looked tired but determined. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "I want you to take over as sole operations manager effective immediately. Tommy will be moved to a different department with reduced responsibilities." You know what's funny about success? Sometimes it tastes even sweeter when it comes with a side of vindication. I accepted the promotion with a calmness that surprised even me. After all, this wasn't about the title or even the money anymore. This was about proving that real-world experience and hard work mean more than a framed piece of paper on the wall. And watching Tommy clean out his corner office that afternoon, I couldn't help but think about all those nights I'd spent working overtime to pay his loans. But this story isn't quite over yet. Because while karma had dealt its first hand, I still had one more card to play. And this one would ensure that neither my father nor my brother would ever underestimate me again. Have you ever watched someone who once looked down on you suddenly realize that you're now the one holding all the cards? Remember Marcus from the warehouse? Well, he played a bigger role in my revenge than anyone could have guessed. After Tommy's demotion, he started desperately job hunting, his pristine resume filled with his accomplishments at Maine Green Landscapes. But somehow, every local business he applied to had already heard about his management style and questionable ethics. That's when Marcus called me with an interesting proposition. The warehouse had an opening for an entry-level position, heavy lifting, long hours, minimum wage. The exact kind of job Tommy used to mock me for doing. I made sure Marcus scheduled Tommy's interview for a day when most of my old warehouse colleagues would be working. Tommy showed up in his expensive suit, clearly expecting his business degree and former title to carry weight. Instead, he found himself being interviewed by the same people who had watched me struggle for 2 years while making his loan payments. People I'd shared lunch breaks with, who'd covered my shifts when I was too exhausted to continue. People who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. The look on his face when Marcus handed him a standard warehouse uniform and told him his shift would start at 4 a.m. was something I'll never forget. But I have a business degree," he stammered. Marcus just smiled and said, "So do half the people working here. Your shift starts tomorrow." The first month of Tommy working at the warehouse was pure poetry. Every morning, he had to park his BMW next to the beat-up trucks and old sedans in the warehouse lot. Every day, he had to do the physical labor he once considered beneath him. And the best part? His new salary meant he could barely afford his student loan payments, the same ones I'd been covering for 2 years. But here's where the twist comes in. Remember how Dad had agreed to repay all the money I'd spent on Tommy's loans? Well, I had other plans for that money. I took every cent, all $28,800 plus interest, and used it to start a scholarship fund at the local community college. The Thomas Sullivan Memorial Scholarship for Warehouse Workers Seeking Education. Yes, you read that right, the memorial part was just to mess with him. Now, every year, hard-working warehouse employees would receive education funding in my brother's name, while he struggled to make ends meet doing the job he once ridiculed. The local paper even ran a story about it, complete with quotes from me about how my late brother had always believed in the dignity of warehouse work. Tommy had to endure weeks of confusion from people offering condolences about his own death, while Dad was too embarrassed by the whole situation to correct anyone. The scholarship announcement went viral in our small business community, and Tommy couldn't even protest without admitting to his past deception. The final cherry on top? I made sure the scholarship had one special requirement. Recipients had to maintain complete financial transparency with their families. You know, to prevent any unfortunate misunderstandings about employment and income. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just about getting even, it's about making sure the lesson sticks. And every morning when Tommy punches in at 4 a.m. at the warehouse, he's learning that lesson all over again. My sister Amy called me last week, laughing so hard she could barely speak. Apparently, Tommy had tried to explain to his new coworkers that the scholarship named after him was all a big misunderstanding. They just nodded sympathetically and said they were sorry for his family's loss. Have you ever heard the saying, "Living well is the best revenge"? Well, sometimes living well, while watching your enemies struggle with the consequences of their own actions, is even better. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a scholarship award ceremony to attend. I hear this year's recipients are very grateful to my deceased brother for his generous legacy.